starting with Brian Higgins. He was present at 34 Fairview Road on January 28th to 29th. He was close friends with the homeowner, Brian Albert. He had a prior romantic interest in Karen Reed. He did not expect Karen and John O'Keefe to be at the Waterfall, that bar, on January 28th. Karen Reed did not greet Higgins, despite the fact that they had previously exchanged flirtatious texts and that she had been at his apartment one evening, although there was nothing that took place between them any more than a peck of a kiss. At the Waterfall, Higgins does not engage with John O'Keefe. He does not say goodbye to John O'Keefe and Karen when he leaves, but before he leaves, he texts Karen, and that text was something to the effect of, well, with a lot of M's. We know that there was a preservation order from this court, your predecessor, Judge Krupp, to preserve his cell phone, and that Trooper Proctor gave him an edict, an order to serve on Brian Higgins, and he left it at the front desk of the Canton Police Station for him. And that Higgins, we learned through the federal investigation, Higgins became angry, demanded that Proctor come back, and he essentially upbraided him and read him the riot act, which shows a little bit about Higgins' personality. At the end of the night, everyone discussed going back to 34 Fairview, and when he gets back to 34 Fairview, he texts not Karen, he texts John O'Keefe at 12:20 a.m. He testified before the federal grand jury that he had no knowledge that they had been invited to 34 Fairview, but that is contradicted by this text message. And the inference is that he was coaxing John to come to that house. And, we're not saying this gives him a motive to kill John, but we don't have to show that. Any motive to feel hostility or animosity towards John O'Keefe goes to his motive. And Your Honor, when Brian Higgins and Brian Albert are in that house, they're the only two people who are unaccounted for when the rest of the group was in the kitchen. And they claimed that they were looking at photographs together. And we have evidence that they were in the basement. We believe that Brian Albert made a mistake before the state grand jury by testifying they went upstairs to look at photos. Brian Higgins says unequivocally that the only place the two went was into the living room to look at photos, the military ribbons, whatever they were looking at. Brian Higgins did not know that Brian Albert had said they went upstairs. And he also testified he had never been upstairs at Brian Albert's house in his life. That means that if Brian Albert said they went upstairs, they're coming up from the basement. And before leaving 34 Fairview, Brian Higgins testified he was parked right in front of the mailbox. He would have had to have walked by where John O'Keefe's body was. His headlights, when he got in his vehicle, would have been illuminating where John O'Keefe's body would have been in the yard if it were actually there. So how does he not see it? He then goes back to the Canton Police Station at 1:30 in the morning after leaving 34 Fairview. He claimed to do some administrative work, but then he admitted to the federal grand jury that he was there to move his car because of the upcoming snowstorm. This suggests that he was fabricating a reason for going back to Canton Police to establish an alibi for himself. He was asked several times at the federal grand jury if he had any conversations with anyone before he went to bed. And when was he notified that John O'Keefe was dead? In the morning, he said. He testified under the pains and penalties of perjury that he had absolutely no contact with any person that night for any reason whatsoever. But he apparently was surprised that the federal authorities had subpoenaed his phone records, and he had to admit, and he did admit under oath, he made that 2:22 a.m. phone call around the same about 5 minutes before Jennifer McCabe is Googling how long to die in the cold, about 8 minutes before Brian Loughran, the plow driver, first drives by the house and sees nobody at all. And the next morning, Brian Higgins, the first person he spoke to was Brian Albert. Your Honor, I left off with the morning of January 29th. The first person that Brian Higgins spoke to was Brian Albert. He had missed a call from Chief Kenneth Berkowitz earlier. Immediately after getting off the phone with Brian Albert, Brian Higgins drives back to 34 Fairview, where he has a meeting with just about all the witnesses in this case: Brian Albert, Julie Albert, Jennifer McCabe, Matthew McCabe. And immediately after that friends and family meeting, on his day off, which is a Saturday, he returns to the Canton Police Department, where he speaks with all of the first responding officers who had anything to do with this case. So this is a quote unquote witness accessing and communicating with all the first responding officers, we would argue monitoring what they're doing in regard to the investigation. According to Brian Higgins, he admitted that Chief Berkowitz is one of his best friends, and that's why he had access to all these people. We have a law enforcement witness who will testify to seeing Chief Kenneth Berkowitz and Brian Higgins alone with Karen Reed's vehicle on the afternoon of January 29th of 2022 for, quote, a wildly long time.
So is this a name that's been in the materials? Is this a name known to the Commonwealth? Or
Yes.
Is this somebody new? Okay.
We've now received video surveillance from the Canton Police Department that shows that there is an interior camera in the Sallyport garage where the car was housed. But during the exact time that third-party officer indicates that Berkowitz and Higgins were in the Sallyport together, the video mysteriously cuts out for 42 minutes. Between 5:08 and 5:50 p.m. And just to be clear here, we never get to see the condition of the taillight when it's brought into the garage. When we do see the car, we see it after Brian Higgins, Chief Berkowitz, Michael Proctor, and Yuri Buchnick have all had access to it. At 5:36 p.m., the car pings that it's arrived in the Sallyport. That's during the missing video. Trooper Proctor, Trooper Buchnick never sees Brian Higgins' phone. They speak with him, and he takes it upon himself to use his own resources, Brian Higgins, within the federal government to ask a friend, Special Agent Matt Kelch, to download only the text messages in his phone between Karen and him and John. And that's it. We have to take his word for it that we got all of them. And we certainly don't have any communications between him and Brian Albert, for instance. On February 10th, when he shows up to his interview with Troopers Buchnick and Proctor, he brings with him copies of the text that he has deemed relevant in their murder investigation. And he hands them the copies of the extraction that he had his friend do. He then calls Matt Kelch the weekend of this incident to do the limited extraction. He never tells Trooper Buchnick or Trooper Proctor how he extracted the tests, despite the fact that it was done by a friend of his in the federal government. During the federal proffer, Brian Higgins admits that he had been served with a preservation order, and the Commonwealth told him he could destroy his phone despite the order. He then drives to a military base on Cape Cod, opens his phone, breaks the SIM card, and throws the phone away. And he says that he discussed destroying his phone with Brian Albert. Brian Albert also destroyed his phone. And Brian Albert said that he had received some text that concerns him as an explanation. And after that, Brian Higgins changes his phone number and changes his cell carrier. In short, he was present that night, he had a motive, and there is plenty of consciousness of guilt cover-up evidence with regard to Mr. Higgins.